Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.
I'm Aurora Bella Austriaco, President of the Chicago Bar Association. Here to help educate us about informed patient care are Dr. Ernest Butel and Brian Hurst, partners with the law firm of Butel, Hurst, Bolke, LLC. Ernest Butel received his medical degree from Loyola University and completed his cardiovascular thoracic surgery residency at Cook County Hospital. In 1985, Dr. Butel obtained his law degree from Loyola University, and in 2001, he left the practice of medicine to work full-time as a civil litigator, concentrating in the area of medical negligence. Brian Hurst obtained his law degree in 1995 from the Illinois Institute of Technology, Chicago-Kent College of Law. Mr. Hurst has had extensive civil trial experience litigating cases on behalf of injured people and the families of wrongfully deceased people. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's really great to have you here because most of the time when patients go into the hospital, they really don't understand what it is that they're signing, or forms are given to them and they just look at it, right? So we can start off by asking you, what is informed consent? And is it one that if forms are given to me, do I have to sign it if I'm the patient?
Well, you know, Aurora, again, thank you for having us here, because this is a topic that I think people need to be educated about. Informed consent in particular, I will defer to Dr. Butel, my partner, to talk a little bit about that from the physician's point of view. But from the patient's point of view, it's very important that when you're working from such a knowledge deficit like you are in a healthcare setting where you're dealing with healthcare professionals, dealing with lay people that have very little understanding of the topics that they're discussing, that you really need to educate yourself as part of the informed consent process. Again, I'll defer to Dr. Butel for the specifics of informed consent in the patient care setting, but from the point of view of a patient, I think it's incumbent upon patients to try to educate themselves as much as they can.
Right. Dr.
Sure.
Butel?
So hospitalization is a frightening and intimidating experience, having procedures the same. Okay. When we talk about informed consent, there's different venues that the informed consent takes place in, and at different times. For example, for elective surgical procedures or elective procedures, for urgent procedures, and then for emergency. And certainly the scenarios as they play out differ, whether it's elective, urgent, or emergent. Informed consent is a process. It's not necessarily a piece of paper. And the process involves a discussion with the patient, or preferably with the patient's family or the advocate for the patient, to explain to the patient what the procedure involves, sometimes in great detail, what the procedure's risks are. And the risks oftentimes are unknown to the patient. In the emergency situation, they may have no idea or no way of researching what the risks would be. And then certainly alternatives to whatever is being done. In other words, what are my options? What's available to me other than to have the procedure that you're talking about doing or performing on me? Now, the informed consent process, we sometimes think of it, the lay public sometimes thinks of it basically as signing a piece of paper with a lot of legalese and medical terminology in it, which is very difficult and, again, very intimidating for a patient to understand. The process, though, involves a conversation and a discussion, as I said, with the patient, patient advocate, family members, and the physician and the healthcare, sometimes the healthcare team. It doesn't necessarily apply just to surgical procedures. It can apply to other diagnostic procedures like CT scans when intravenous contrast is given, or when a needle aspiration biopsy is done, which is certainly might be considered a minor procedure, not done in an operating room, but nevertheless an invasive type of procedure. One of the alternatives is nothing. To do nothing may be an alternative, and there may be a situation in the patient's history, in the family dynamic, in the patient dynamic, that says the best option for this patient is to do nothing. The form that is generally presented, as I said, is filled with legal and medical terminology. It's incumbent upon the physician, though, to document in the medical record what the discussion was about, what the discussion discussed, the risks, benefits, alternatives of the procedure. And that may take the form of a handwritten progress note. Nowadays, with computer technology and the electronic hospital record or electronic medical record, it may take that form. But I think for the physician and for the patient, that documentation becomes very, very important. The other thing is that if, for example, a procedure is an elective procedure or an urgent and not an emergent procedure, that the patient perhaps takes some time in thinking about what's going to be done before signing a form or a series of forms. And it may require that the patient watches a videotape or a DVD about the procedure and may get some study information about the procedure that he or she can read, study up, and come back and talk to the physician. In the best world, the options would be presented to the patient at the initial encounter by the healthcare provider, and the patient is then permitted to come back to the healthcare provider and discuss the benefits, risks, options, and the procedure.
Right, and that's actually very good because it's very extensive, but realize also that most patients who go into the hospital probably don't even know what to ask, or don't even know that they can actually say, let me think about it, or give me some information so I can make an informed decision on certain things. Is there like a patient's checklist that, you know, for patients going to a hospital, what are the things that they could ask their physicians? Do they need to sign the forms? What are the things that they can, you know, particularly ask? Is there a video, like you mentioned, that we can actually view, you know?
Sure. So there are specialty organizations, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American College of Surgeons, for example. These organizations oftentimes provide videos, pamphlets, and other types of documents to patients or make them available to doctors' offices. These are oftentimes held in the office, in the waiting area, or sometimes in the examining rooms. And the physician or other healthcare provider may give this document or documents or even a copy of a video or DVD to the patient and have them kind of study up on it. The other thing that a patient can do, or one of the other things that they can do, basically is go to the internet, and as the internet is there for everybody now, and everybody talks about Dr. Google. I heard a term this morning about cyberchondriacs, that if you read enough information about disease processes and procedures, you end up becoming a cyberchondriac. And so that's a new term of art, I guess, that you got to be careful what you read. You have to understand what you read, and don't be too intimidated about what you read.
Is there a treatment for cyberchondriac?
You know, Aurora, I think the point through all this is really about balance, because you know, you can sometimes, from the patient advocate point of view, the patient themselves push a little bit too hard. So you really need to strike a balance. And the same thing goes for educating yourself about these issues. You need to strike a balance. You have to take in the information. You have to try to understand the information. And I think Dr. Butel made a good point, too, when he alluded to the fact of involving other people in the process. Oftentimes, if you're sick, if you're in the hospital, it's very difficult to make those kinds of decisions. And if you have family, if you have friends, and it truly does take a village sometimes. If you have family, if you have friends that can help you educate yourself, if they can help educate you about the process, and if they can help communicate with the healthcare physicians in an effective way, it really makes medicine better. And that's really what this is all about. Better medicine, less injured people, better for everyone.
Right, and that's really important to point out, the advocates for the patient, because at the end of the day, you really want to make sure that they have that.
And oftentimes the advocate for the patient has to be the patient.
Right.
And I've seen it in my own family, in healthcare settings where you can push too hard as the patient. but you do want to ask relevant questions. And I think that is really the key to the patient's perspective in the healthcare setting, is to ask good and relevant questions. That means you can't try to educate yourself on something that a physician may have taken 3 years, 4 years, 5 years of a fellowship to learn and understand, because they're not going to take that kind of time with you. But you do need to ask good, informed, and relevant questions, because it'll oftentimes get healthcare providers thinking the way they should be thinking, and better care will result.
Right, right. Now, there's another term that's actually thrown out a lot there, HIPAA. Tell us a little bit about HIPAA and the genesis of it, if you want to mention a little bit about that, and what really that protects.
Well, HIPAA is a federal statute that protects healthcare information. It protects healthcare information so that other individuals cannot know about your own health issues. And you can think about that. That's very important in a healthcare setting, that you can be open with your physician, that you share things that you might not otherwise share with anyone else in the world. And you need to have that open communication with the physician, and HIPAA helps that because it helps protect records. Dr. Butel can talk about that also from a physician's point of view, but from a patient's point of view, patients need to know that they're protected by confidentiality, and therefore they need to have open and frank discussions with their healthcare providers.
Yeah, I think the genesis or origins of HIPAA had to do with the AIDS epidemic and with the sale or distribution of information about patients, in particular to drug companies. This information was readily available, and in many instances there were very definite invasions of patient privacy. One of the most strident examples, though, of the violations are hospital elevators. And I have to admit, being guilty of this, getting on elevators with residents and medical students, family members are on the elevator from other families or from the family members of the patient and start talking about the case. Well, what did you think about that blood count or that chest x-ray or that CT scan? That is not allowed. These conversations should be private, should be confidential. Any discussion that takes place between healthcare providers, any type of healthcare professionals, should be done with the permission of the patient. And that basically is what this law requests us to do. And as Brian said, it's a federal statute. It's just that important. I want to go back to something else that Brian said. He used the word communication. And communication is really important. And I think in the era of the technology that we now deal with, that everyone can communicate with one another with texting. And so you could be sitting next to someone and text them and not talk to them. It's very important in the process of communication that we communicate with the patient and with the patient's family, and that we understand things like family dynamics, family spirituality, religion, cultural backgrounds, because information that we may tell to a patient or the patient's family may not be taken in the way that we think it should be taken or is taken. An example, though, for example, would be the diagnosis of cancer. If you're seeing a patient and you're planning to do, let's say, a lobectomy on the patient for cancer, and this is the first time that the patient has been exposed to the diagnosis of cancer, well, that patient, once that patient hears the diagnosis, that patient oftentimes, more often than not, cuts out everything else, doesn't hear anything else that you're saying. And basically, that was my point earlier about saying, come back and let's talk about this. Let's spend more than the 7 minutes that's allotted me to talk to you. Come back after hours, or come back, no charge, just come back, and I want to go through this with you again and explain this to you and let you have time to think it over. And if you need to talk to me, call me. If you need to email me, email me. But let's get this straightened out so you understand and your family understands what you're getting into before we embark upon care and treatment.
And I think that's what makes you a very good doctor, is because you have the patient's interest on hand and as an advocate for the patient. However, there are, I'm just anecdotally, there are doctors out there who will say something but really does not expound on certain things. So as a patient, would you recommend patients, if there's a certain serious diagnosis, that they go for a second opinion? Some of them are even asked to tell their doctor, I want to get a second opinion. Do you even advise?
Aurora, it kind of brings to mind the setting where you're in a hospital room with the physician. He or she comes in for a few moments. The family's there with the patient in bed. The doctor has a cursory conversation with the patient, pats him on the leg and says, you're going to be fine, and kind of walks out. I think the advice to any patient is you have to be comfortable with your healthcare provider. Does that mean you have to get a second opinion in every circumstance? No, because maybe the first opinion is an opinion you're comfortable with. So it doesn't always have to be about a second opinion. What it has to deal with is comfort level, how much you trust the physician you're dealing with. Is there a good flow of communication back and forth? Are your questions being answered? Is the doctor taking the time with you that they should be taking to answer the questions that you legitimately have? And if you're comfortable and you find a healthcare provider that satisfies those needs and those desires, then it's probably a good physician-patient relationship, and there's no need to seek out someone else. But if you're not comfortable with the exchange, if you're not comfortable with the dynamics, then again, it's really incumbent on the patient to seek out a physician or a healthcare provider that they're comfortable with, that they can have that good free flow of discussion and conversation, and so that good medical decisions can be made both by the physicians and by the family or the patient that has to make decisions on that end as well.
Right. Relationship is very good. Communication is very good. Something goes wrong. At what point, or what's the process that's involved? There's a medical malpractice that's going on here. As a patient, at what point does the patient really make kind of like a determination? And what do they do if they feel that something wrong has gone wrong?
And it's a very difficult question to answer because so many circumstances are different. In fact, there's no two circumstances that are exactly the same. And you can find yourself in a situation where if you act too soon, you could act to your own detriment in a healthcare setting. If you wait too long, you may wait too long to your detriment in a healthcare setting. So it really is a tough balance, and it's really about, again, educating and informing yourself, determining whether what is happening to you should be happening to you. Have those conversations that we talked about with your healthcare providers. But first and foremost, I think more important than the medical malpractice analysis is the healthcare analysis. In other words, that the patient gets good care and comes out of the situation better than they went in. And if you can avoid having to come and see a lawyer about a medical malpractice case because your patient care setting worked the way it should, and you worked the way you should, and you came out better than you went in, then it's all good and you don't need to come and see a lawyer, and that's really what we would rather. The problem is, because there is poor healthcare practiced out there, there are bad results that are a result of negligence, and that's when people find people like us, and what they do is they generally give us a call. They send us medical records after we have a discussion with them, and then the process of reviewing the case takes place. In a firm like ours with Dr. Butel, the first review is always Dr. Butel's, because he does this, he did this for a living. And as you mentioned, I think pretty astutely in just the brief conversation that you've had with Dr. Butel, you see the kind of a person he is, the kind of physician he was, and the way he does his job now. So it's important that you're also therefore comfortable with the attorneys that you would ultimately have to seek out if that's the outcome that warrants it.
And I want to emphasize also, when a patient sees you for a malpractice action, you don't just take any case in every case. There is that process. In addition to, you mentioned Dr. Butel reviewing it, is that the certification that's required?
Well, as I said, in my firm, the first review of a medical malpractice case is Dr. Butel, because frankly, he's involved in the intake, he discusses the case with the patient. Eventually the plaintiff, if there is a case, but there are always patients when they come to us. And then he will reach out to physicians to go through the rest of the process if he believes there's something there to pursue. That is part of what you're talking about, the 2622 requirement in Illinois, where you have a physician certify the essentially worthiness of the case, to say that it's a case that deserves to be filed. Dr. Butel does that as well, or better than anyone I've ever seen. The way he goes about the process of looking at every aspect of the case is really mind-boggling, that he has the time and the energy and the intelligence, frankly, that he does to be able to do the reviews the way he does the reviews. So it's been an honor for me to be able to work with someone like Dr. Butel, because of the opportunity that gives me to learn about medicine, to see about what patient care really means from a doctor who really made it about his life to do that.
I think that means you have to buy Mr. Hurst lunch after that comment.
I think you're right. Can I go
Sure.
back to the issue of the second opinion?
Sure.
There are patients who go for the third and fourth opinions sometimes because they're looking for a specific answer, and if they don't get it from the first doctor or the second doctor, they're going to go to number 3 or number 4.
Right.
I'm not talking about those cases right now. Physicians should not be afraid of a patient who asks for a second opinion. As a matter of fact, the physician should encourage the second opinion. Patients should not be afraid to ask the doctor for a second opinion and say, can I get a second opinion about this? How does that work? Because if and when that patient comes back to me and they're going to go for surgery, they're a better prepared patient. And there's a greater level of trust between the patient and the physician who is treating the patient. And that is so important. It always goes back to trust. Medicine is a sacred honor, and it is built upon the trust between the doctor and the patient. So the patient and the doctor should never be afraid of asking for the second opinion.
Right.
They're
right.
better prepared patients.
Yeah, yeah. Now, let me ask you this. When there's a medical malpractice, I mean, as a patient, you really don't know when it's going to happen. So would you recommend a patient to maintain a daily log, a health log or a diary of what happened during the course of, the surgery or after surgery, pre-surgery, or while staying at the hospital? Or you really don't see any need for that? Because you just don't know when it's going to happen, and you don't know when it's going to be helpful.
Sometimes that can be helpful, but from our perspective, I think, and we focus so much on the outcome of the healthcare and it being a good outcome, that I think that people really need to focus their energies primarily on getting well, and not worry themselves about documenting a medical malpractice case. If they are a victim of malpractice and they've suffered a bad outcome, then certainly family members and friends can help them do that. But from the patient's perspective, it's really important to get better. And you need to focus your energies on getting better and doing the things you need to do to get yourself well, as opposed to trying to focus on things that are going to distract you from the task at hand, which is to get yourself well. So, it can be helpful in certain circumstances. And certainly if somebody believes that something has occurred to them that shouldn't, that's probably the time to start documenting and getting your ducks in a row.
Right.
I guess when in doubt, ask. If you're not sure, ask about what happened. The fact is that in our office, our mantra is, you don't need a lawyer, you need a doctor. Because oftentimes, most often, the patients that come in to see us really need continuing medical care, and they need ongoing care, and they really don't need us as attorneys. And so the best advice that we can give them is go out and continue looking for or continue with your medical care. Complications aren't always malpractice. Most often, they're not. When there is a situation where the patient suspects that there is a malpractice case, then it's incumbent upon the patient or upon us to get the medical record, review the medical record. In the case of deaths, the autopsy becomes incredibly important, because oftentimes that is the final verdict. In spite of CT scans, MRIs, ultrasounds, it is still the forensic pathologist or the hospital or clinical pathologist who can give us the best answers as to what happened in a particular case where there's a death. Because what they'll do is they'll not only look at the autopsy, but they will also review the medical record.
Right. Now,
and you know, Aurora, if I can,
Sure.
just real quickly, and you did ask about documenting it, and I would jump in here on Dr. Butel's comments, that is one thing I would recommend, or I would say is an important aspect of the patient care setting. If there is the ultimate bad outcome and someone does not make it out of the hospital, and you're asked about an autopsy, it is very important that you authorize autopsies. Sometimes you won't be asked about an autopsy, but it might be important for you to bring that up to the healthcare providers and say you would like an autopsy. There are private services that do autopsies out there. Hospitals do autopsies. If it's a suspicious case, the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office will do an autopsy. But that's oftentimes a very critical piece in the evaluation. So I did want to mention that because it does touch upon a question you had asked earlier.
right.
You know, and the thing, what does happen is oftentimes the consent for the autopsy is relegated to the lowest person on the poll, the first-year surgical resident or the second-year medical resident. So they're oftentimes intimidated or frightened to discuss autopsy and the reasons for doing the autopsy. And that's why it's important for the patient's family or the patient's advocate to keep that in the back of their minds and to ask for it and not to be timid or shy about asking for it. The other benefit to it is that medical science does gain valuable information from an autopsy. And there are too few and far between in this era of modern technology. And there's still a need for autopsy, even in cases where there's not medical malpractice.
Right, right. Now, are there resources available out there that patients can take a look at, like maybe websites or organizations for further information on patients' rights or advocacy?
Sure. There are multiple numbers of websites. The websites that I did have in mind were websites that deal with treatment and diagnosis, like the Cochrane organization, the Cleveland Clinic, the Mayo Clinic, Hippocrates, spelled with an E, and organizations like that. And of course, I mentioned earlier Dr. Google. AARP has websites which will help patients in understanding and guiding them through the maze of medical care. So there are a variety of websites that are available. Realize that not all websites are as comprehensive as you would like them to be. And incidentally, there are apps which are now available for folks with smartphones that they can actually get the app from the Mayo Clinic or from the Cleveland Clinic and have that on their phone. And if there's a question that they have in mind, that they can look it up readily. Physicians are using these apps. There are apps with normal blood values, which may not come to mind immediately, but you can look it up on your smartphone. Right. There are diagnostic and treatment protocols, which you can look up. So basically, this technology is wonderful. Not everyone has to carry a big copy of Harrison's textbook under their arm.
Right, right. Gentlemen, I wish we had more time, but Dr. Butel and Mr. Hurst, thank you for empowering us to be informed advocates about our health care. I'm Aurora Balastriaco. Thank you for watching the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly.